The Psychology of Violence. Why we destroy each other. Part 1. Violence is as old as humanity itself. From the very beginning of civilization, stories of bloodshed, war, cruelty, and destruction have been woven into our history. From Cain killing Abel in the biblical tale to modern wars tearing nations apart, one question continues to haunt us. Why do human beings destroy each other? Is violence simply a product of anger? Or is it something far deeper, buried in our psychology, our survival instincts, our need for power, and even our sense of fear? To understand this, we have to go step by step through history, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and social dynamics to uncover the complex layers that make us capable of extraordinary kindness on one hand and unimaginable cruelty on the other. 1. Violence as a shadow of survival. At its core, violence is tied to survival. Long before cities, governments, or laws existed, human beings lived in small tribes and clans. In this environment, survival was not guaranteed. Food was scarce, predators lurked, and rival tribes threatened territory. In such conditions, aggression was not only natural, it was necessary. Evolutionary psychology tells us that aggression and violence were adaptive traits. The men who could fight were more likely to protect their families, secure food, and pass on their genes. Those unable to defend themselves were more likely to perish. Over thousands of years, this survival instinct became etched into our DNA. But here's the paradox: the very instinct that once saved us continues to haunt us in the modern age. In a world with governments, police, and abundance of resources, we no longer need violence to survive, yet our brains are still wired for it. 2. The biology of aggression. If we want to understand why humans destroy each other, we cannot ignore biology. Our brains, hormones, and chemistry all play a critical role in shaping violent behavior. The amygdala, this almond-shaped structure in the brain, is our emotional alarm system. When it senses a threat, it triggers fear and aggression. In violent individuals, studies show that the amygdala is often overactive, making them more reactive to perceived danger. Prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain controls reasoning and self-restraint. In many violent criminals, the prefrontal cortex shows reduced activity, meaning they have weaker impulse control and struggle to regulate anger. Hormones. Testosterone has long been linked with aggression, though not in a simplistic way. High testosterone doesn't guarantee violence, but it does fuel dominance behaviors, which can escalate into aggression. Meanwhile, low serotonin is associated with impulsivity and loss of control. In short, our biology creates the potential for violence, but it doesn't force us into it. The environment, upbringing, and social conditions often act as triggers that ignite these biological sparks. Fear, power, and the need to control. One of the strongest psychological drives behind violence is fear. When people feel threatened, whether physically, emotionally, or socially, they often lash out. Violence becomes a way to re-establish control over their world. Think about domestic violence. Abusers often justify their behavior by saying they were losing control or felt disrespected. In reality, the violence isn't random, it as a desperate attempt to regain power in a situation where they feel powerless. The same psychology scales up to nations and leaders. Dictators throughout history, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, used violence to maintain power and crush opposition. For them, violence wasn't just about survival, it was about control, domination, and fear. For its social identity and group violence, another key to understanding why humans destroy each other, lies in group psychology. Alone, many people would never commit acts of extreme violence, but in groups, everything changes. In group versus out-group, human beings naturally divide the world into us and them. Psychologists call this social identity theory. When people strongly identify with a group, they are more likely to see outsiders as enemies. Violence becomes justified if it protects their group. De-individuation. In mobs, individuals lose their sense of personal responsibility. Hidden behind the mask of the group, they may commit acts they'd never consider alone. Riots, lynchings, and even genocides have roots in this phenomenon. Obedience to authority. Stanley Milgram's famous experiment showed how ordinary people could administer painful shocks to others simply because an authority figure told them to. Violence often flourishes under orders, especially when moral responsibility is shifted elsewhere. Group dynamics turn ordinary people into soldiers, executioners, and aggressors. Alone, they might be kind fathers, mothers, or neighbors. In the group, they become killers. 5. Violence as a learned behavior. We cannot ignore the role of learning and culture. Violence is not only biological, it's taught, modeled, and normalized. Children who grow up in abusive households are more likely to become violent themselves. Media, movies, video games, and even news can desensitize us to violence, making it feel normal. Cultures that glorify honor and revenge often produce higher levels of interpersonal violence. Psychologist Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment demonstrated that children imitate aggressive behavior when they see adults model it. In other words, violence is contagious. If we live in a violent culture, we are more likely to become violent ourselves. 6. The dark pleasure of violence. Here is the most uncomfortable truth. Violence is not always committed reluctantly. Sometimes it brings pleasure. Neuroscience shows that the same brain areas that light up during sex or eating can also activate during acts of revenge or aggression. For some, hurting others provides a twisted sense of satisfaction, power, or even joy. History is filled with examples of crowds cheering at executions, soldiers boasting about their kills, or gangs glorifying brutality. This dark side of human psychology reveals that destruction can sometimes feel rewarding, an intoxicating drug that people come back to again and again. 7. Why we destroy each other. So, when we put all these layers together, biology, fear, power, group identity, learned behavior, and even pleasure, the puzzle begins to make sense. Humans destroy each other not because they are inherently evil, but because we are wired for survival and dominance. Our brains are vulnerable to fear, rage, and impulse. Groups can twist morality and justify cruelty. Culture teaches us violence as a response to conflict, and sometimes destruction simply feels good. Violence, then, is not one thing. It is many things: a survival tool, a cultural lesson, a biological reaction, a social performance, and a dark source of pleasure. 8. The hope for change. Yet, despite all of this, violence is not destiny. If it were, human civilization would have collapsed long ago. The very fact that we are capable of love, empathy, forgiveness, and cooperation shows that violence is only one side of human nature. The other side is compassion. Understanding violence is the first step to controlling it. By recognizing the psychological forces behind it, we can begin to break the cycle through education, empathy training, conflict resolution, and building cultures that reward peace instead of bloodshed. The Part 1, approximately 2,500 words. Kodja's mind main groundwork. Raqqa. Evolutionary roots of violence. Biology of aggression, fear, and power. Group psychology. Learned violence, dark pleasure in destruction. Framework of why we destroy each other. The psychology of violence. Why we destroy each other. Part 2. If Part 1 was about the roots of violence, its biological, evolutionary, and social beginnings, Part 2 takes us into the real-world manifestations of violence. From wars that killed millions to everyday domestic abuse behind closed doors, violence takes many forms. To understand why humans destroy each other, we must explore these contexts, their psychological triggers, and the chilling truths about human cruelty. 1. War. Organized violence. War is perhaps the most visible form of human violence. Nations mobilize millions of people, invest billions of dollars, and sacrifice generations in conflicts that often begin with ideology, land, or power. But why do humans wage wars so readily? Psychology of war. Dehumanization of the enemy. To kill someone, soldiers must first see the enemy as less than human. Propaganda paints opponents as animals, cockroaches, or demons. Once the enemy is stripped of humanity, killing becomes easier. Obedience and duty. Soldiers are trained to obey orders without hesitation. This suppresses individual morality and replaces it with loyalty to authority. Group bonding. In war, soldiers form brotherhoods. Fighting for the group, for comrades, becomes a source of meaning. Violence becomes part of loyalty and honor. The paradox of war. What's fascinating is that many soldiers do not hate their enemies personally. Instead, their violence is an act of obedience, fear, and survival. And yet, war shows how easily ordinary people can participate in extraordinary destruction when systems of authority and identity push them toward it. 2. Genocide. The psychology of mass violence. If war is violence between nations, genocide is violence against identity itself. It is the systematic destruction of an ethnic, religious, or cultural group. From the Holocaust to Rwanda, genocides reveal the darkest depths of human cruelty. Why genocide happens. Scapegoating. In times of crisis, leaders blame minorities for society's problems. The group becomes a threat that must be eliminated. Moral disengagement. Psychologist Albert Bandura explains that people commit atrocities when they disengage from their own morality by blaming victims, minimizing consequences, or justifying actions as for the greater good. Normalization. violence escalates gradually. At first, discriminatory laws are passed. Then hate speech becomes common. Finally, mass killings are normalized as part of society's agenda. The psychology of genocide shows that evil is not always driven by monsters. It can be carried out by ordinary people, convinced they are doing something necessary, even righteous. 3. Domestic violence, the silent epidemic. Not all violence is on battlefields. Much of it happens in homes, hidden behind closed doors. Domestic violence, abuse between partners, parents and children, or family members, is one of the most widespread forms of human cruelty. Why domestic violence happens? Cycle of power and control. Abusers often seek to dominate their victims, using fear, intimidation, and violence to maintain control. Stress and frustration, financial pressure, social stress, or feelings of inadequacy can trigger violent outbursts. Psychological impact on victims. Victims of domestic violence often develop trauma, depression, and PTSD. They may also experience learned helplessness, a psychological condition where they feel powerless to escape the abuse, even when opportunities exist. Domestic violence reveals how the psychology of power, fear, and control plays out on the smallest, most intimate scale within families. 4. The psychology of cruelty. Cruelty is violence taken one step further, not just hurting, but hurting with intention, sometimes with enjoyment. Why would humans deliberately inflict pain on others? The Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a mock prison with college students assigned as guards and prisoners. Within days, guards began abusing prisoners, insulting them, humiliating them, and using physical punishment. The experiment had to be stopped after only 6 days. This showed how quickly ordinary people, when given power and authority, can descend into cruelty. The psychology behind cruelty. De-individuation. In uniforms or roles, people lose their personal identity and adopt the group's behavior. Moral justification. People convince themselves that cruelty is necessary. Discipline, justice, or protection. Enjoyment of power. For some, cruelty provides pleasure because it affirms their dominance over others. Cruelty shows that violence isn't always an accident of rage. Sometimes, it is calculated, intentional, and disturbingly satisfying for those who inflict it. 5. Violence in everyday life. We often think of violence as extreme wars, genocide, murders, but violence also exists in subtle, everyday ways. Bullying in schools, workplace harassment, cyberbullying on social media, road rage, incidents of public humiliation or verbal attacks. These everyday forms may not always involve bloodshed, but psychologically, they are still destructive. They rely on the same dynamics of power, fear, and control that underlie larger forms of violence. 6. The role of fear and insecurity. If we strip violence down to its psychological essence, one root appears again and again: fear. Fear of losing control leads to domestic violence. Fear of outsiders fuels racism, xenophobia, and genocide. Fear of weakness drives people to lash out to prove dominance. Fear of death makes nations go to war, preemptively striking enemies. This fear often creates a cycle. One act of violence produces retaliation, which produces more violence. This is why conflicts, whether personal feuds or global wars, can last for generations. 7. The myth of the evil person. When we see violence, we often assume the perpetrators are simply evil, but psychology tells a different story. Most violent people are not psychopaths or sadists. Many are ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Violence often comes not from monsters, but from fear, insecurity, obedience, and social pressure. This doesn't excuse violence, but it helps us understand it. By seeing violent people as human beings shaped by psychology, culture, and environment, we can better address the root causes rather than just labeling them as evil. 8. The cost of violence. Finally, we must ask, what does violence cost us? Beyond the obvious deaths and injuries, violence leaves deep psychological scars. Victims suffer trauma, grief, and long-lasting emotional wounds. Perpetrators often face guilt, shame, and disconnection from society. Communities suffer cycles of mistrust, fear, and broken relationships. Societies waste resources on wars, prisons, and policing instead of education, health, and progress. Violence, in the end, destroys not just lives but also the possibility of a better future. 9. Toward understanding. Part 2 has shown us how violence takes form in wars, genocides, families, and daily life. It has revealed the psychology of cruelty, fear, and insecurity that drives people to destroy one another. Yet, within all this darkness lies a crucial lesson. If violence is not simply evil but the product of psychological, biological, and social forces, then it can also be prevented. Understanding is the first weapon against destruction. If we can see how ordinary people become violent, we can build systems, cultures, and communities that steer us toward empathy, compassion, and peace. The psychology of violence. Why we destroy each other. Part 3. Violence has traveled with humanity for thousands of years. It is in our myths, our wars, our homes, and even in our thoughts. But if violence is part of who we are, does that mean peace is impossible? The answer is no. Understanding violence doesn't condemn us to repeat it, it gives us the power to transform it. In this final part, we will explore how to break the cycle of destruction and build a future rooted in empathy, justice, and peace. 1. Understanding the cycle of violence. Before we can break violence, we must understand how it sustains itself. Psychologists describe a repeating cycle. Tension builds, stress, fear, or resentment begins to grow. Violence occurs, an outburst, abuse, or conflict erupts. Justification. The aggressor finds reasons to excuse the violence. Normalization. Over time, victims and societies begin to see violence as part of life. Repetition. The cycle starts again. This cycle applies not only to domestic abuse, but also to wars, terrorism, and intergroup conflicts. Unless something interrupts this cycle through accountability, healing, or structural change, violence continues. 2. Education. Teaching peace early. One of the most powerful tools against violence is education. Children are not born violent, they learn it. If we can change what they learn, we can change the future. Emotional intelligence. Teaching children to understand and manage their emotions reduces the risk of violent outbursts. Conflict resolution skills. Instead of teaching fight back, schools can model negotiation, compromise, and dialogue. Empathy training. Simple exercises like imagining another person's feelings can rewire children to respond with compassion rather than aggression. Research shows that when children are taught empathy and conflict resolution, rates of bullying and school violence drop dramatically. 3. Restorative justice. Healing instead of punishing. Our justice systems often rely on punishment. A crime happens, the offender is punished, and society moves on. But punishment alone doesn't always break the cycle of violence. Sometimes it makes it worse, creating anger and resentment. Restorative justice takes a different approach. Instead of focusing only on punishment, it focuses on healing. Offenders meet with victims to hear the impact of their actions. Communities work to repair harm rather than simply inflict suffering. Accountability is still required, but the goal is transformation, not revenge. This doesn't work in every case, but in many, restorative justice has reduced repeat offenses and created genuine healing. 4. The role of empathy. At the heart of peace is empathy, the ability to feel what another person feels. Neuroscience shows that empathy activates the same brain regions that light up when we ourselves are in pain. This means that empathy makes another's suffering feel like our own. But empathy doesn't just happen. It has to be cultivated through storytelling, listening to the experiences of those different from us, through exposure, meeting people from other cultures, religions, or backgrounds, through art and literature, because stories create emotional bridges. When empathy increases, violence decreases. A society that learns to see each other's humanity is far less likely to destroy itself. 5. Breaking down the us versus them mentality. One of the greatest triggers of violence is tribal thinking, dividing the world into us and them. To prevent violence, we must dissolve these divisions. Dialogue programs. Bringing opposing groups together for conversation humanizes the enemy. Shared goals. Research shows that when rival groups work together toward common goals, like community projects, hostility decreases. Inclusive identity. Expanding our sense of identity beyond tribe, race, or nation to include all humanity reduces the urge for destruction. This is why global movements for human rights, peace, and unity are so powerful. They remind us that beneath differences, we are the same species. 6. Healing trauma. One overlooked driver of violence is unhealed trauma. Victims of violence often become perpetrators later. Nations scarred by war often fall into new conflicts. Unless trauma is addressed, violence repeats across generations. How to heal trauma. Therapy and counseling. Giving individuals space to process pain reduces the likelihood they'll pass it on. Community support, healing circles, rituals, and collective mourning help societies recover. Acknowledgement. Victims need their suffering recognized. Denial fuels resentment, while acknowledgement opens the door to closure. Healing trauma transforms victims into survivors, and survivors into peace builders. 7. The role of leadership violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. Leaders, whether political, religious, or cultural, play a massive role in either fueling violence or calming it. Toxic leaders use fear, hate, and division to maintain power. Transformational leaders inspire unity, compassion, and hope. Examples abound. Nelson Mandela, after decades of imprisonment, could have chosen revenge, but instead, he preached reconciliation. His leadership prevented South Africa from collapsing into civil war. Leadership matters. One voice can ignite genocide, but one voice can also heal a nation. 8. Media and culture. We live in a world where violence is constantly broadcast. Movies glorify war. News highlights killings more than acts of kindness. Social media spreads outrage faster than empathy. To reduce violence, we must reshape culture. Responsible media, highlighting stories of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Art for peace, music, film, and literature that inspire compassion instead of cruelty. Digital responsibility, combating online hate speech and cyberbullying. Culture shapes psychology. If our culture glorifies violence, people will mirror it. If it glorifies peace, people will follow it too. 9. Personal responsibility. It's easy to see violence as a big problem for governments and leaders, but real change begins at the individual level. Self-awareness, recognizing our own anger before it turns into violence. Mindfulness practices, meditation, breathing, and reflection can reduce aggression. Choosing compassion in small conflicts, traffic arguments, misunderstandings. Choosing kindness over escalation breaks the cycle. Each individual who chooses empathy creates a ripple effect that can shift entire communities. 10. The future of humanity. The final question is, can humanity ever escape violence completely? Realistically, violence may never disappear entirely, but psychology, history, and progress suggest that it can be reduced dramatically. Consider, rates of violent crime have declined worldwide over the last century. International laws now punish war crimes and crimes against humanity. Peace movements, diplomacy, and global cooperation are stronger than ever before. The future will always hold conflict, but it doesn't have to hold destruction. By understanding the psychology of violence, we gain the power to rewrite humanity's story. Conclusion. Choosing who we become. Violence is part of our past. It may even be part of our wiring, but it does not have to define our future. We destroy each other because of fear, power, insecurity, and dehumanization. But we also have the capacity for empathy, healing, and love. Every act of compassion, every dialogue across differences, every choice to forgive rather than fight, these are the seeds of peace. The psychology of violence teaches us that destruction is never inevitable. It is a choice, sometimes unconscious, sometimes cultural, but always a choice. If violence is a choice, then peace is a choice too. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: the same mind that destroys can also rebuild. The same hands that strike can also heal. The same species that created war can also create peace. The question is not whether violence exists. The question is whether we will continue to let it rule us or whether we will rise above it, choosing to protect, to love, and to build instead of destroy.